Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about domain and range. So we actually did this when we were working with graphing inequalities. When we were writing our solutions to the inequalities according to our number line, another way to look at that was domain. For example, say we had something that was graphed. I don't know, we'll say this is -3, -4, -2. And maybe it was a closed circle going all the way to the right. We said that the interval notation to represent that solution was -3 with a bracket, and it went all the way to a positive infinity, and infinity always got a parenthesis. Well, if you kind of compare that horizontal line to the horizontal line of a coordinate axis here, they look really similar. So when we're talking about domain, we're just talking about the x values like a number line. So what we're going to add into it now is also the ranges. Before we get there, let's quickly review when we use parentheses and brackets. So you are going to be using a bracket if you have a solid dot on something or if you have a solid line on something. In that situation, you would be using a bracket. If you have an open circle or a dashed line, those get parentheses. And remember that infinity always gets a parenthesis. The other thing we need to remember is where our positive and negative infinities are at. So remember that the horizontal axis is always x, the vertical axis is always y. When we're talking about the x's, the left-hand side is negative infinity, the right-hand side is positive infinity. When we're talking about the y's, which have to do with the range, the bottom is negative infinity and the top is positive infinity. Take a moment to pause the video to copy down these notes. They'll be very helpful to get you through the rest of what we go through. Did you copy it down? Great job. So let's just think about what we're looking at on this graph. The first question below says, with which value of x does the graph begin? So if you look here, we have this line graphed. It lines up with this number right here on my graph. So that would be -2. So it begins at -2. And where does my graph end? Well, it ends right here, that picture shown. So if we count our lines over, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it ends at 5. So how could we write this in interval notation? Remember, we said solid circles get a bracket. So all the x values that are included on this graph is from -2 to 5. And we put brackets around it. Another way of looking at this, if we get out the highlighters, we want to know what values are this graph covering as far as x's go. So if we look here, all this line crosses all of these x values all the way to here. So what are those numbers relating to? This is -2 and this is 5. So it goes from -2 to 5. Okay, so now let's look at our range. I'm going to have to erase this to make it make more sense. So when we look at our range now, it says, with which value does the graph begin? Now, when they say begin, they're always referring to the smallest value. So on the y-axis, that's always going to be the bottom. So right here is where my graph begins. That cuts through the -2 line. So -2 is where it begins. Now, where does the top part of my graph go? Right here. And if we count our lines, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. It goes up to the 4. That's where my graph ends. So again, if I do my highlighting here to show where I'm looking at on the y-axis, all of these values here are included. So it goes from the -2. It goes from the -2 all the way up to the 4 with solid dots. So they both get brackets. How does that feel so far? Still a little confused? I understand that because this is just plain weird sometimes. So a good way to look at it, when you're thinking about domain, domain is talking about the x values. So when you're talking about the x values, remember that you always read a book from left to right. So you read your domain from left to right. Oops, I can spell right correct. Sorry about that. Okay, so it's always left and right. If anything, I might change this and to the word to. When we're talking about the range, that's looking at the y-axis now. So for the y-axis, it always goes bottom to top. So bottom to top. If you keep that in mind, the rest of it should go a little bit easier. So let's look at our practice problems. What sometimes is helpful is if you have a note card. So if you have a note card sitting at home, you can go ahead and grab it, pause the video and go grab it. Otherwise, a nice straight edge like a ruler would be helpful as well. So if we look at number 1, I want to start with the domain on it. So for domain, I'm always looking from left to right. So if I look at the far left part of my graph, the far left part lines up with -2. So right here. So on the x-axis, on the x-axis, that matches up with -2. So I'm going to put a -2 to start it. Again, that's a solid dot, so it gets a bracket, comma. Now I'm going to take my note card and line it to the end, the far right of my graph. So looking at the far right, it lines up right here. So if I move my note card out of the way, okay, count 2 lines to the right, it ends at +2. So a +2. And again, that's a solid dot, so that gets a bracket. If I take my note card and I kind of swivel it around a little bit, so now I have it going this direction, this is where I start to look at my range values. So where is the bottom part of my graph? I'm going to do this in a different color. So the farthest down this graph goes is right there. So if I count how many lines down, it's down 1 line. So that is -1. Again, a solid dot is a bracket. And now if I see where the top part of my graph is, so it's way up here. So again, I'm going to draw a line to kind of show where it's at and move my note card out of the way. Okay, so it's up 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. So it ends at a 4, and again, it gets a bracket. Is it getting better? Let's try another one that has an arrow on it. This graph is kind of neat. We're actually going to skip number 2. So don't worry about number 2. This one's going to get a little bit more complicated than what we want to get through. And we're actually going to jump to number 3. We're going to turn our note card to the side so I can look at the domain, because remember, domain is looking at the x-axis. And I'm going to ask myself, where is the far left-hand part of this graph? So if I slide my note card, if I slide my note card over, I see that it matches up right here. And there's actually a nice vertical line where it matches up. But right here is where it crosses or it meets up with the x-axis. So if I move my note card out of the way, okay, that's at 0, counting backwards, -1, -2, -3. So the left-hand part of my graph is at -3. Again, it's a solid dot, solid line, so that gets a bracket. Now here's where it gets a little silly. If we move our note card to the far right-hand side, do we all see how there is an arrow? As soon as you see an arrow on the right-hand side, remember when we did our little graph up above, we labeled where positive infinity was. We said the right-hand side was positive infinity and the top was positive. The left-hand side was negative infinity and the bottom was negative. Well, I have an arrow and it's pointing on the right-hand side. So an arrow on the right-hand side tells me that this graph goes to positive infinity, and infinity always gets the bracket. We're going to follow those same steps, but now we're going to turn our note card to the side. So where is the bottom part of my graph? The bottom part of my graph lines up right here. So if I look at what number that is, that's -1, -2, -3. Again, that bottom part has a solid dot, so it's going to be a bracket at -3. If I move my note card to the top part of my graph, do you see how there's a nice defined line right here? Because there's a nice stopping line right there, that is the top part of my graph. I never go above it. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is where it goes to with a solid line, so it gets a bracket. Don't forget that parenthesis in the middle. How is it feeling now? Is it getting a little bit better? All right, let's look at the back side. We're only going to look at a few of these. Okay, so if we look at our next graph, it is a star. So again, I want to know with which x values does this entire graph go towards. So because I'm looking at x, I'm going to turn my note card this direction, and I'm going to see where it lines up. Do you see that on the far point of that x, it crosses right here? Do we see that? And if I slide my note card over, it crosses at the very end, so it crosses right here. Sometimes it's easier to see a visualization by coloring it in with a highlighter. So I want to know what x values does a star go cross through, the star cross through. So here, and if I keep going, I have this graph pictured in this little area. Okay, so if I'm thinking about x values, this is a 1, and this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Always helpful to do it twice. So do you see how that star goes through the x values of 1 to 7? Well, I'm going to do 1 with a bracket and 7 with a bracket because that star has nice solid lines on it. So now I'm going to take that same graph. I'm going to erase all that highlighting that I did, and I'm going to look at the domain part of it. And I'm going to use the highlighting to kind of help us out again this time. So if I look at the bottom part of my graph, how far down does that star go? Well, it goes to this point right here. And so then if I ask myself, how far up does this graph go? Okay, well, the tippy top of my star is right about, let's see here, here. You can just barely see the point right there. So it goes to right there. So if I move this out of the way and I use my whole shading idea to kind of see what y values, how tall this star really is. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight. If you see here, the star goes through, there's a line drawn everywhere in between here. So now that I see where my lines are drawn, it matches up with -2 on the bottom. And if I count up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the top. Again, it's nice solid lines. So brackets, -2 to 5. So essentially, you're just saying, where is that picture being shown? Number 5, this is a great one. We're going to start with our domain. So I'm going to turn my note card on its side to see where the far side of my thing is at, my graph, my picture. Do you see how on the far side of the graph, even though my arrow is pointing down, it's still going towards infinity here. But because it's the left-hand side, we call that negative infinity. Whenever you have an arrow on the side, that's going to be either positive or negative infinity. If I go to the right-hand side of my graph, again, do you see how I have an arrow? Okay, well, there's no stopping point. So this side is positive infinity, meaning if I were to extend this graph out to keep going and going and going, it would keep getting wider and wider and wider and wider, and it would keep getting wider and wider forever and ever and ever. So it's going to keep going all the way to the right, and it's going to keep going all the way to the left because it keeps getting fatter. So our domain is negative infinity to positive infinity. That's different from the range. So now if I look at the range, the bottom part of my graph, let me erase this stuff to get it out of our way so it doesn't confuse us. So now if I look at my range part of this, where is the bottom part of my graph? Do you see how we have arrows pointing down? It doesn't matter if it's 1 arrow or 2 arrows. No matter what, the arrows are pointing down, meaning it's going to keep getting lower and lower and lower. So that is negative infinity. On the flip side, when we go to the top, there is a definite stopping point. This dot right here, our graph does not go past. So right there is the tippy top of my graph. So if I look here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, oops, sorry, 5, that is the top part of my graph. So while the domain is negative infinity to positive infinity, my range, bottom to top, is negative infinity, but it definitely does not go above the 5. Let's try one more like this. and then hopefully you'll have enough to look on. I understand this is a little confusing. Tools such as a highlighter or a note card could be very beneficial in seeing visually where the top and bottom of your graph is and where the left and right side of your graph is. I would highly recommend using those.